Well, this has been an interesting challenge, and I may have been banging my head against the wall just a little bit. I wanted to match the guitar tone and the overall production of At the Gates' classic album Slaughter of the Soul entirely in the box using only plugins. This album was groundbreaking both musically and production-wise when it came out in 1995, defining the Gothenburg style of melodic death metal, essentially creating the genre of metalcore and inspiring countless imitators. Despite the impact this album has had, the production circumstances were less than ideal. Everyone was young, producer Fredrik Nordstrom was relatively new to the game, and the band had no money to afford great equipment. It may come as a shock to some, but this legendary guitar tone came from an HM2 running into a metal zone through a PV solid-state amp and a homemade guitar cab with 2 broken speakers. This was especially challenging given the speed and intensity of the music, the perfectionism and tightness the band wanted, and the extremely loud and consistent drumming. While it may not be the best-sounding metal album by today's standards, it's a classic and highly influential sound, and I wanted to do my best to honor its legacy. So without further ado, I present to you my cover of Blinded by Fear, the opener of the album, and then I will tell you all about how I mixed it and achieved the sound. I hope you enjoyed that. There's a lot of quirks to the sound of this album that were hard to fully emulate, but I hope more than anything that I captured the vibe and the spirit of this album. So let's check out what I did. First, I'm going to play you some of the isolated guitars, and then I'll show you what I used. So firstly, I'm playing in B standard on my 7-string. I have passive pickups. I heard that the band used EMG 81s, but I don't have any, so I hope that it gets close enough with that. The first pedal I'm using is the heavy pedal from Audiority, which, if you've seen my videos, you know I talk about quite a lot. I really like this thing. It's the best HM2 emulation that I've seen, and since the band used that as a preamp, that's what we're going with. They didn't say exactly how they used the HM2, except that the distortion was off, so it was boosting the metal zone and acting sort of as a pre-filter EQ. We all know that the HM2 is supposed to have all the knobs up, but in order to get this sound right, I thought that the high control or mid control was adding too much of the sort of nasally upper mids that I wasn't hearing in the album. So unless they EQ'd that out later, I think that perhaps they didn't have the high control all the way up. So this is how I set it to get the guitar as close as I could. Next, I've got this free plugin from Mercurial. This is a metal zone emulation, and this one was really sort of hard to dial in. I went back and forth a lot. I don't know how close these settings are to what the band used, or if these settings would work in your setup or anything. All I know is I was trying to match it by ear, and this is what I ended up dialing in. It took me 3 or 4 tries trying different things, and I don't know if this is the best setup or anything, but just to show you what I used, that's what I did. I didn't have the distortion cranked way up, but again, on the album, it doesn't sound completely overblown with the distortion. So, and there's also a lot of level coming in from the HM2 that is going to raise the distortion on this rather than just using it on its own. For my guitar amp, I'm using the L12X solid state amp from Audiority. I was trying this originally with the Archetype Gojira on the clean channel, and that works pretty well, but I thought this amp sounded a little more lo-fi, and it's got this weird contour control that helped me get the sound. As a running theme in this, the EQ is just madness. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. I just went back and forth between the pedals and the amps and tried to dial it in to get as close as I could. It's weird, I know, but hey, if it works, it works. The cab the band was using was a homemade one with 10-inch and 12-inch speakers, which is odd. I have no idea what kind of speakers they were, but I just figured V30s will be pretty close. This is pretty much what Fredrik has used on other albums. Fredrik Nordstrom uses 2 SM57s for most his tones with an off-axis mic and an on-axis mic and blends them. This is the stock IRs that came with the Ignite Emissary bundle in NAD IR. I'm just using those mics. I've got the balance shifted slightly towards the off-axis mic to give it a little darker sound. If you listen closely to the album, even though the guitar tone is quite aggressive, it doesn't have a ton of super high frequency information, so I am going for a slightly darker on the top end kind of sound. I have the low pass at 9 kHz and a high pass around 100. Then I've got running into a multi-band compressor, which is a pretty standard trick for just tightening up the low end. It basically compresses on the chugs, the palm mutes, to just tame things. I have no idea if they did that on this album, but it helps tighten things up a little bit. I use it a lot. I have one more crazy EQ here. I tried to go easy on this one, and while I was working on this, I had so many different EQs, stacking EQs and just going crazy, but it ended up sounding kind of weird sometimes, so I tried to rein it back in and just do some surgical cuts on the mids, boost some of the upper mids. I did cut out some of the low end and left the top end alone because it was already basically where I wanted it with the other plugins. Lastly, I have one final extra high pass and low pass EQ. The high pass is at 80 and the low pass is at 6.2. That's lower than I would usually put it, but I think it makes the sound more accurate to the album. That's a summary of the guitar tone. I would say the settings are really kind of up to how you're dialing it in and the guitar you're using. I was just referencing the album and this back and forth a lot and just trying to make little tweaks where I was hearing, oh, I've got too much mids there, or my high end's too much. I would usually make the guitars brighter than on this album, but it works for the sound. And if you listen, the drums don't have a ton of super high frequencies too. And some of that may be down to the fact that they recorded on tape or just the EQ preferences they had. Either way, it sounds good, and it was fun to do something that's a little different than how I would do it. The next most important thing is the drums, of course, so here they are. Thankfully, unlike the guitars, I kept the drums very simple for this. I'm using the new One Kit Wonder Metal, which I love. It's a great library, and it comes pretty much ready to use just out of the box. So I started with, I think, the Mix Ready preset, and then I just tweaked some things to my liking. I've got the parallel and master EQ on. The reverb is lower. It's a fairly dry sound on this record, but it sounded weird without any reverb. The main thing I did with the drum mix is just getting the levels where I think they sound right, and each of these drums has a balance button, which controls the balance of the different mics. So I'll just go through those quick. The kick drum here is mostly the close mic, a little bit of the overhead, no room, no reverb. The snare, I boosted the overhead on this a fair bit, and it's got a good amount of room and very little reverb. The toms, I left alone. These were whatever the stock sound was. I thought they were fine. For the overheads, I noticed on this album, the hi-hat is not too loud, and the ride is very loud. So I took down the hi-hat volume a little bit, and I left the ride up. There's a little bit of reverb on the overhead. And then the room sound overall is pretty low in this mix, and it just sort of straight across the board with the cymbals. I wasn't too obsessed with getting the drums to sound exactly like the album. That would be pretty difficult in a plugin like this, but I think they are close enough. I kept the velocities pretty high on the MIDI tracks because this album is very aggressive and the drumming is very consistent. I always use the humanize feature on the MIDI tracks in Reaper to give it a little more realness, but I kept those values a little lower than I might normally to keep it quite tight still. Also on the drums, I've got this global EQ on the stereo drum bus, and that's cutting out some of the mids around 500, and I'm kind of boosting the aggression attack of everything around 5K, but then rolling off some of the top end. Again, just trying to get it closer to how the drums sit on the album. Next up, let's listen to the bass. There's a brief bass break in one of the songs on the album, which gave me a little sense of how it sounds isolated. It was fairly dark and it had some distortion on it, so that's generally what I was going with here. The bass in the mix is overall not that high, but it is definitely present. It adds more lows and maybe low-mid information than anything else. So again, I'm using the metal zone as distortion on the bass. I've got the highs and the mids rolled back quite a bit, and the distortion is not too extreme on this one. For the amp, I'm just using the Ampeg SVT VR because I like it and it's convenient. So it sounds good. I've got the ultra high and ultra low off on that, and the treble and bass are both rolled back a little bit. Then I'm hitting it pretty hard with a 1176 style compressor, which is just giving it about 5 to 10 dB of gain reduction to keep it nice and even. Lastly, I've got a high pass, low pass filter to just keep it in the right range. I actually have it high passed fairly high because there's not a ton of super low information on this album from the bass, at least. Mostly it's coming from the kick drums, and overall this album doesn't have as much bass as most modern records do. I assume given the time period it came out that helped it translate better to smaller systems and maybe your cassette Walkman or whatever people were listening on, so it probably sounded better not to have the bass too crazy on the album. I normally wouldn't high pass this much on a bass, but without it, it sounded too boomy in the low end, and it just stepped on the kick drum too much. For the leads, I've got it set up similar to the rhythm guitars with some tweaks. The HM2 you see here has the EQ maxed out, and the metal zone is set a little bit differently in this case. I'm rolling off a lot of the highs on the metal zone. I'm running the clean channel on Archetype Gojira. I think this is basically the stock settings and the stock cabinet. I've got a little bit of delay and reverb on it, but nothing too extreme. The EQ is really where I shape the sound of this, and I'm cutting off a lot of lows and highs. The leads on the album are fairly smooth, they're not boomy, and they have a very pronounced mid character. So I wanted to get something similar to that, and I really like how the leads sound. This EQ may look dramatic, but I think it sounds good. So let me just play you the isolated solo. I really like how the EQ filters that sound and gives it almost a radio voice kind of quality. I think it fits really well into the mix there and captures some of that 90s early modern metal vibe. The last element in this mix is the clean guitar overdub before the solo, and it sounds like this. I originally did it on the neck pickup, but I thought it sounded too dark and too open. So I went and re-recorded it on the bridge pickup, and I thought that sounded more like what's on the album. I'm running it first through this 1176 style compressor, which gives it just more of that clean guitar spank and helps it sit in the mix better. I'm then running it through the clean channel of Archetype Gojira again. I have changed the settings a little bit, rolled off the bass, increased the mids, rolled off the treble, bright switches off. I've got a touch of chorus on it. I don't know if there was chorus used on the album, but it's fairly low and I think it sounds good. And then I've got some more stereo delay and reverb just to give it some more life. Lastly, I have another crazy EQ for you here. I hate to even show this, but again, I was just doing this by ear to get to sound right and boost some of these weird mids. And again, it's relevant in the context of the mix, and there's no real reason why it looks this wild otherwise, but I was just working by ear. I also have the clean guitar panned 32% right, which I think is roughly sort of where it was on one side of the album. Also, the rhythm guitars on this album sounds like the right channel is slightly louder and might have a different tone on it than the left channel. Mainly the fact that it's louder or more present sounding is a little odd to me, but I have these guitars running stereo through the same amp, so that's not going on this mix. And for my mastering chain, I am rolling off some of the low end first and a bit of the high end, again, just to keep it in line with the overall EQ of the album. There's also a slight cut here at 770 Hertz just because it sounded right to me. That is then going through a high pass at 50 Hertz, which is higher than I normally would, but this album has a very tight and controlled low end, so I thought it sounded right. I don't know. I have that going through a tape emulation just to maybe get some more analog tape sound. It's pretty subtle. It hardly makes a difference. Then I have that going through my master bus compressor, and that is hitting around 4 dB, release on auto, attack at 30, and the ratio at 4. That just sort of glues everything together and makes the mix sound more powerful. That is then finally going through a limiter, which is fairly mild in this case, just chopping off some of the peaks. So that wraps up the details of this mix, and I wanted to show you how I got all the sounds, but at the same time, some of the EQ choices and stuff are not my general recommendations or how I even normally work, but really just referencing the album and trying to get my mix to sound more similar. And so some of the EQs look a bit odd, some of the settings are a bit strange. I don't know how close they are to what the band was using, but obviously, we're not using the same equipment. I don't have their speaker cab, I don't have their guitars or their hands. So I'm just trying to make these two sound similar. And I hope you can pick up some tips from that, or at least satisfy your curiosity. I think it's straightforward enough to get a similar guitar sound, though I wouldn't say this is the best guitar sound in the world. But if you like the sound of this album and you want to get that style, putting the HM2 before a metal zone does have a cool sound, and it will get you in that ballpark pretty much right away. At the Gates has never said exactly what the settings on their pedals were or published a photo of it, and they may not remember, so it's probably lost to history. We may never be able to recreate this tone 100%, but we do know the combination of those pedals gets you pretty close. Run that into a clean channel of just about any amp, especially a solid state amp, and it's close enough. The rest is down to experimentation and your taste and what you're going for. There's so many elements that go into a mix that trying to capture exactly his guitar tone is going to be really difficult without having the same preamps, and who knows what Frederick was doing with the EQs after he recorded the guitars. It feels to me like the EQ on the final guitar tracks on the album was a bit heavy-handed perhaps, or shall we say just changed the sound of the guitars a lot. So it's kind of hard to recreate some of that. I like the guitar tone on this album. I think it's pretty unique and cool, and it's different from a lot of other modern recordings with just a 5150 and a V30 or something. If you have the pedals or you want to try this with plugins, it's a cool tone to emulate, and I will provide links in the description for the plugins I used. Some of them are free, so that's cool. I hope you enjoyed this. I had fun making it, so thanks for watching, and smash that like button and hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.